I feel like the word visual novel is fairly new for a lot of Western fans. If I had to be exact, I'd say a majority of English-speaking players had only been vaguely aware or even completely unaware of the word visual novel until maybe January 4th, 2012. That's the date the English freeware game Katawa Shoujo hit the scene and made many people fans of the genre. Or at least that's the impression I get reading around on the internet. Today, visual novels occupy a sizable niche within the Western gaming community, with all sorts of titles, both from Japan and by Western developers, available on popular storefronts like Steam. With this surge in popularity, both fans and critics have begun throwing the term visual novel around all over the place to classify basically anything that bears even a surface-level similarity to the genre, especially if they are Japanese in origin. Games that were once classified as adventure games, like Ace Attorney or Hotel Dusk, are now being called visual novels, or visual novel adventure games, or sometimes visual novels with point-and-click elements. I've even seen some people call games like Persona 5 a visual novel with RPG elements. Pretty much any Japanese game that is heavily story-based and is mainly presented through character portraits and text boxes is being labeled a visual novel in the West. The visual novel genre originates in Japan and has a long history that is directly connected to the Japanese adventure genre, all of which is deeply locked away behind a thick language barrier. I think a lot of the misunderstandings about visual novels has to do with the fact that a majority of fans in the West have only recently become aware of the genre, and many of the games that led to the genre's creation are not available in English, causing a lot of confusion and misinformation. So I wanted to try and clear some things up about visual novels by looking at their history and their relationship to adventure games. Bear in mind that I do not know Japanese, therefore I cannot really play most of these games, since they mostly consist of reading, but I'm going to do my best. First thing to understand is that all visual novels are adventure games. Let me explain. It is basically like how action RPGs and turn-based RPGs are both still role-playing games. Visual novels are just a branch of the much larger family tree of Japanese adventure games. Visual novels don't look anything like the classical Western definition of an adventure game, which includes point-and-click titles like Maniac Mansion, or modern games like those once released by Telltale. But if you look at the history of Japanese adventure games in Japan, it makes a lot more sense. Just like how many fans classify the Elder Scrolls series as Western RPGs, and titles like Final Fantasy as Japanese RPGs or JRPGs, it will be helpful to think of adventure games in the same way. There are Western adventure games, and there are Japanese adventure games. Both have their origin in text adventures, like Zork or other Infocom titles. And both were heavily influenced by Roberta Williams' Mystery House, which was one of the earliest graphical adventure games and was popular in the West as well as Japan. However, after this point, the two regions went down different paths with the genre. And just like how the origin of JRPGs can be traced back to Yuji Horii Dragon Quest series, Japanese adventure games can basically be traced back to another Yuji Horii title, 1983's The Porto Pia serial murder case. A prototypical crime story, Porto Pia has the player take the role of a detective investigating a murder, with the assistance of another detective named Yatsu. There are other Japanese adventure games released before this, but Porto Pia, specifically the more popular 1985 Famicom port, is the title that in many ways created the modern adventure game in Japan, and would start many traditions and conventions that other Japanese developers would copy. Unlike many Western adventure games of the time, Porto Pia is presented in a first-person perspective, instead of the third-person view seen in many point-and-click titles. There is also a much larger emphasis on character interaction, with the game not being able to progress unless you talk to certain people in a certain order, whereas Western adventure games tended to focus much more on environmental puzzles. The screen is separated into 3 windows, one for visuals, one for text, and finally a verb window, which is the player's main tool for interacting with the world. The game is about gathering pieces of information from conversations with other characters, and collecting items that can be presented as evidence, which allows the story to move forward. A magnifying glass can be taken out at any time as well to examine the background of any scene, and just the same an icon of a hammer can be used to hit anything in the background, both of which can reveal new information to the player. The world can be navigated in a somewhat non-linear fashion, allowing the case to be solved in a different order each playthrough, and even contains multiple endings depending on which character the player chooses to arrest, although there is only one true ending. This is the basic template that all future Japanese adventure games would follow. The reason Porto Pia was so different when compared to many Western adventure games was due to a difference in inspiration. A lot of Western developers at the time were inspired by the first text adventure, a title called Colossal Cave Adventure, which was about navigating a large and complex environment in order to find treasure. Yuji Horii, on the other hand, was inspired to make Porto Pia out of the desire to create a program in which the user could have a conversation with the computer. He tried to do this when he was first learning BASIC on his NEC PC-6001, but soon found it to be impossible. However, after seeing Western text adventures in magazine articles at the time, specifically Infocom's Deadline, he thought of adapting his idea into the context of a mystery game, where the player could have scripted conversations with NPCs in order to solve a case as a detective. This is why the game is built around character interaction, and why the presentation is first person, because it's supposed to be the player talking with the computer. This style of presentation is very similar to visual novels. However, Porto Pia and the many adventure games that imitated it were far more focused on problem solving, with their progression often being blocked behind puzzles and their writing being direct and terse. Dozens of adventure games were released on the Famicom due to Porto Pia's success, but a lot of the biggest changes in the genre would happen on Japanese computers, similar to the West. This is yet another reason why so much of the early history of Japanese adventure games is lost on Western fans. Titles released on machines like the NEC PC-6001, PC-88, PC98, MSX, FM Towns, Sharp X1, and FM7 are very obscure in English territories, and practically none of these were released on home consoles or translated in any form. The Japanese adventure genre would change and simplify over time, as most game genres do. But one of the most important steps in its transformation into visual novels would be System Psychom's Novelware franchise, which lasted from 1988 to 1990. The first Novelware game, Dome, would release in 1988 and was based off a series of books called Dome Prelude to the End, which were written by Shizuku Natsuki, a prolific Japanese writer who was famous for her mystery novels, such as The Tragedy of W, which was released in North America as Murder at Mount Fuji. The game has the player control an employee at an advertisement agency who has to convince the populace to donate money to go towards the construction of a facility called the Dome, which will protect everyone in the ensuing atomic war. The Novelware titles were basically adventure games in a similar vein to Porto Pia, often containing verb windows and puzzles, but were much more focused on delivering a fully featured story. The selling point of the series was that the games were written like a novel, containing plenty of dialogue and descriptive text, instead of the sparse sentences one would often find in early adventure titles. Problem solving was greatly simplified, and some entries didn't even have puzzles, including the first entry, Dome. The 6 other titles released under the Novelware brand name would feature all kinds of different stories and settings, ranging from a fashion designer using her psychic powers to investigate the death of a former classmate, to a game about the son of a video game developer president who has to run his father's company while he's in the hospital. This idea of making an adventure game more like a novel is a key step in the history of the genre, and would be taken further by Chunsoft, the company who itself created the Famicom version of Porto Pia several years earlier. Chunsoft was a company founded in 1984 by Koichi Nakamura, the man who created one of Enix's first video games, a puzzle game called Door Door. Nakamura and his company had assisted many publishers over the years in creating their games, most famously developing the first 5 Dragon Quest titles, with Nakamura himself serving as a director and main programmer on the first 4 titles. However, in 1992, Chunsoft would create their first self-published game for the Super Famicom, a horror game called Ohto Risa, the Japanese name for the St. John's wort flower. The game has a basic horror movie setup. A young couple's car breaks down during a storm, and they must take shelter in a spooky abandoned mansion. However, the game itself was far more original for its time, and was marketed by Chunsoft as a sound novel. Ohto Risa was quite literally a digital novel. The story's text covered the entire screen, and the game even simulated turning the page of a book. Visuals took a back seat, with the only graphics being mostly static backgrounds that would sometimes have limited animations or effects layered on top of them, such as rain and lightning. Atmospheric storyline, hence Chunsoft calling it a sound novel. Player interaction was simplified to the point that the only input was pressing a button to advance the text, and selecting choices that could branch the story to a number of different endings, with the franchise eventually becoming famous for its large number of bad endings. Koichi Nakamura, who was Ohto Risa's director, made the game so straightforward in an attempt to appeal to a more casual audience. A casual audience that maybe didn't even know how to use a controller. He thought that a game mainly about reading, enhanced with the sophisticated sound and visuals of the newly released Super Famicom, would be the most accessible and appealing to new players. Ohto Risa was basically a gamified, choose-your-own-adventure book, and was the title that created the visual novel genre in all but name, featuring almost all of the characteristics and presentation of a modern visual novel. While not a huge success, Ohto Risa was a sleeper hit of sorts, gaining popularity through word of mouth and steadily selling long after its release. So, Chunsoft followed up with another sound novel in 1994 called Kimitachi No Yuri, which translates to The Night of the Sickle Weasel, and would later be localized as The Banshee's Last Cry in ASCII's 2014 translation of the iPhone port. Featuring another horror-themed story, Kimitachi no Yuri is a mystery about a group of people trapped in a ski lodge during a snowstorm, when the corpse of one of the vacationers is discovered. The player must find out who among their group is the killer before anyone else becomes a victim. This time, Chunsoft found success, and Kimitachi no Yuri exploded in popularity in Japan, causing a slew of copycats to be released by other companies. Chunsoft would continue to make games under their sound novel brand for many years, but fans and even other developers also began using the term sound novel as a genre title to classify similar games created by other companies. Throughout the 1990s, dozens of sound novels would be released on the Super Famicom and later PlayStation, eventually leading to an adult video game developer named Leaf throwing their hat into the market as well. In 1996, Leaf released a sound novel featuring adult content for the NEC PC-98 called Shizuku, which translates to drip or droplet. The game is about a young man investigating why one of his fellow students suddenly began clawing her own face after seemingly going mad during class, which leads him to uncovering a much larger mystery involving a secret group meeting after dark at his school. While Shizuku may just look like another sound novel at first glance, featuring a very similar presentation to Chunsoft's titles, it was instead branded as the first volume in the Leaf visual novel series. This is the title that coined the word visual novel, along with many other commonly used terms in the VN community. The key creators behind Shizuku's development, writer Tetsuya Takahashi and artist Toru Minazuki, set out to basically create a sound novel, but ultimately called their game a visual novel simply because their game had a much larger emphasis on visuals rather than sound. While most sound novels had minimal graphics, often not even showing the characters or representing them as vague silhouettes, Leaf's visual novels had defined character sprites with multiple expressions, and full-screen event illustrations, which were often used for sexually explicit scenes. so instead of relying mostly on text and sound to tell its story, like other sound novels, Shizuku also heavily used visuals to convey its narrative. Leaf would quickly follow Shizuku with several other games released under the visual novel brand name, but the popularity of the franchise really took off with its third entry, 1997's Two Heart, which changed the usual horror theme seen in many sound novels to that of romantic high school comedy. Obviously taking inspiration from the rising popularity of dating simulation games, such as Konami's Tokimeki Memorial and Elf's Do Kyusei, Two Heart repurposed its branching structure to lead to different character routes that corresponded with a specific love interest. So instead of making choices to avoid bad endings like past games, the player was making choices to lead to an ending where they could romance one of several girls in the game. Leaf's past visual novels worked in a similar way, but in Two Heart it was much more of the main focus. This new style of novel game would grow in popularity, especially with the otaku audience, and is the origin of the modern-day visual novel. While not all visual novels are about romance, the idea of having more visuals, routes that led to different character endings, and the prevalence of romantic stories, as well as pornographic material, originates from Leaf's titles. The presentation of visual novels would change slightly over time, with most titles containing their text in a window at the bottom of the screen, instead of the full screen style seen in sound novels. However, there are still many titles that feature a similar presentation to sound novels, and the games originally released in the Leaf visual novel series. Other variations of the genre would emerge over time, such as kinetic novels, a term originating from Visual Art's brand of linear novel games, which describes a visual novel that contains no player choice or gameplay of any kind. There are also titles that are hybrids between visual novels and other genres, with the two gameplay styles often being separated into clearly defined sections. Examples of this include titles like Utoarare Mono, which has strategy RPG segments, and Baldur Force, which has mech combat sections. And even the Zero Escape series could be considered a hybrid between a visual novel and a puzzle game. But when a game is classified as a traditional visual novel, it should basically be describing a mixed media digital novel that often has a branching narrative. Now that we got that all out of the way, let's go back to what I said earlier, that all visual novels are adventure games. In Japan, novel games, whether they be visual, sound, or kinetic, are just another type of adventure game, with magazines like Famitsu, including titles like Steins Gate and 428 Shibuya Scramble, in their poll for best adventure games of all time. While that might sound crazy to a Western fan, since they seem so different from a normal adventure game, it makes sense after seeing how the genre has evolved over the years in Japan. But just like in my comparison to turn-based and action RPGs earlier, while every visual novel is a type of adventure game, not every adventure game is a visual novel. A game that is focused on problem solving, containing some kind of fail state, block to progression, or puzzles that need to be overcome, like the Ace Attorney series, is a Japanese adventure game in the most traditional sense. Western fans may think a title like Ace Attorney must be some kind of visual novel, since it has so many surface-level similarities, but that is because visual novels, as we've seen, are just an evolution of the Japanese style of adventure game. Visual novels look like Japanese adventure games, not the other way around. Their presentation may be similar, but what each genre focuses on and how they play are very different. Again, adventure games are about problem solving, and visual novels, or any of the novel games previously mentioned, are mainly about reading a narrative. If you still want to call games like Ace Attorney visual novels, even after hearing my argument, that's fine by me. It's your choice. Hopefully this video was at least a fun history lesson. I may have gotten some stuff wrong, but I hope this has cleared up what a visual novel is for some people. Or at the very least, I hope it's shown that there is a lot about the history of Japanese adventure games that is often lost on Western fans. Thank you.